The smoke still hung in the air when Sergeant James Carter first saw the white flag. It was October 1944, and the town of Lucca sprawled before him through the morning mist like something from another world, medieval walls rising from the Tuscan plain. Terracotta roofs punctured by German artillery, church spires somehow still standing despite everything. His hands trembled slightly on his M1 Garand, not from fear, exactly, but from the bone-deep exhaustion of men who'd been fighting through Italian mud and mountains for months. Behind him, the other men of the 366th Infantry Regiment's Company C waited, their dark faces streaked with dirt and sweat, their eyes hollow from sleepless nights under German 88mm fire. "Think they know we're coming, Sarge?" Private Thomas Washington whispered beside him. He was 19 from Alabama, and Carter had watched him age 20 years in the past 6 months. "They know somebody's coming," Carter replied quietly. "The question is what they'll do when they see who." The Nazi propaganda had been brutal, relentless. For 2 years, the Germans had plastered Italian walls with posters showing caricatured black soldiers as savage monsters, as primitive beasts coming to destroy European civilization. The fascist newspapers had printed lie after lie about American Negroes being criminals released from prisons to fight, about them being cannibals and rapists. Carter had seen some of those posters himself in the ruins of towns they'd taken further south. The images made him sick, not because they hurt his feelings, but because he knew what they were designed to do. They were meant to make Italians fear him more than they feared the Germans. They were meant to turn liberation into terror. "Move out," he ordered softly. "Watch the windows. Keep your spacing, single quotes." They descended into the valley as dawn broke fully over the Apuan Alps, their boots making soft sucking sounds in the mud. The artillery had fallen silent an hour ago. Intelligence said the Germans had pulled back during the night, retreating toward the Gothic line, leaving Lucca open. But intelligence had been wrong before. Carter had lost 3 men last week to a supposedly abandoned farmhouse that turned out to hold a German machine gun nest. He would not lose anyone today if he could help it. The outskirts of Lucca were devastated. Walls had collapsed into the narrow streets. Craters from bombs pocked the roads. The acrid smell of cordite mixed with something sweeter and more terrible: death, decay, the accumulated stench of war. But as they moved deeper into the town, Carter saw movement. A shutter opened slightly on a second-floor window. A door cracked an inch. People were here, hiding, watching, waiting to see what came next. Then they reached the piazza. It was a small square dominated by a fountain that no longer ran, and a church whose facade was pockmarked with bullet holes. And there, emerging slowly from doorways and side streets, came the Italians. Old men first, limping forward with canes, their faces gaunt from hunger. Then women clutching children to their sides, their eyes wide with something Carter couldn't quite read, not fear. Exactly, but not trust either. Wariness, exhaustion, the desperate hope of people who had suffered too long. Carter raised his hand, signaling his men to hold position. His heart hammered in his chest. This was the moment. This was when they would see him, really see him, and he would know whether the Nazi poison had taken root. An old woman stepped forward first. She must have been 70, tiny and bent, dressed in black like all the Italian grandmothers Carter had seen. She moved slowly, one hand pressed against her chest as if steadying her heart. She came within 10 feet of Carter, and he saw her eyes widen as she took in his face fully, his dark skin, his African features, everything the propaganda had taught her to fear. For a terrible moment, no one moved. The entire square seemed to hold its breath. Then the old woman's face crumpled and she began to cry. But these were not tears of fear. She rushed forward with surprising speed and grabbed Carter's free hand, pressing it to her lips, to her forehead, kissing it over and over while Italian words poured from her mouth like a prayer. "Grazie, grazie mio Dio, grazie ... single quotes." The dam broke. Suddenly the piazza filled with people flooding toward them from every direction. Children ran forward shrieking with joy. Women wept openly, reaching out to touch the soldiers' uniforms as if they might not be real. Men embraced them, kissing them on both cheeks in the Italian way. An old man fell to his knees before Private Washington, making the sign of the cross, blessing him as if he were a saint. Carter felt his throat tighten. All around him his men stood frozen, tears streaming down their faces as Italian civilians surrounded them with a love and gratitude so pure, so unrestrained, that it felt like breaking open. These people didn't care about their skin color. These people saw them as heroes, as liberators, as the answer to prayers whispered in the dark. "Sarge," Washington's voice cracked. "Sarge, they're ... they're happy to see us." A little girl, maybe 6 years old, tugged on Carter's sleeve. She had enormous dark eyes and tangled black hair, and she was holding something in her small fist. She opened her hand to reveal a crushed flower, probably the only one still growing in this war-torn town. She offered it to him solemnly, as if it were gold. Carter knelt down slowly, setting his rifle carefully aside. He took the flower with all the gentleness he possessed, and tucked it carefully into his helmet webbing. "Grazie," he said quietly, one of the few Italian words he knew. Thank you." The little girl smiled, and then she did something that would stay with Carter for the rest of his life. She reached out and touched his face with her small hand, her fingers tracing his dark skin with simple curiosity, no fear at all. Then she laughed, a clear, bright sound like bells, and ran back to her mother, who was weeping and laughing at the same time. "My God," Private Jackson murmured behind Carter. "They don't hate us. They actually don't hate us." But Carter understood what Jackson really meant. It wasn't that Italians didn't hate them. It was that Italians saw them as human beings, as men, as soldiers who had bled and fought and suffered to set them free, after a lifetime of segregation, after years of fighting for an army that kept them in separate units, that made them eat in separate mess halls, that treated them as inferior in 1,000 daily humiliations. These Italian strangers were welcoming them with open arms and unashamed tears. It was the first time in Carter's life he had ever felt like a hero. The months that followed were the strangest of Corporal David Hayes's life, and he'd lived through some strange times. The 92nd Infantry Division, the legendary Buffalo Soldiers, had been fighting their way up the Italian peninsula since August, and Hayes had been with them every brutal mile. The Gothic Line, the Germans called their defensive position in the Apennine Mountains, a barrier of concrete bunkers, minefields, and artillery positions that turned the mountains into a killing ground. Hayes had watched friends die in those mountains, had held men while they bled out in his arms, had dug foxholes in frozen ground while German mortars walked death across the ridges. But then came the villages. Every town they liberated, the same scene repeated with variations. The first tentative emergence of civilians. The shock on Italian faces when they saw black soldiers. Then almost always the tears and embraces and desperate gratitude. In Viareggio, an entire family insisted on feeding Hayes's squad, bringing out what little food they had hidden from the Germans' bread. Olives, wine that tasted like sunshine despite the war. In Carrara, marble workers showed them the quarries where they'd hidden supplies and refugees, where partisans had sheltered from fascist patrols. In the Serchio Valley, villagers led them to German ammunition dumps, to observation posts, to every secret the enemy had tried to keep. And everywhere, the children. They came running whenever the Buffalo Soldiers appeared, calling out, "Cioccolato! Cioccolato!" begging for the chocolate bars that American Gias carried. Hayes always gave his away, even when supplies were short, because the joy on those small faces was worth more than food. The children would follow them through the streets, holding their hands, chattering in rapid Italian that Hayes couldn't understand, but whose meaning was clear. "You are safe. You are good. You are welcome here." It did something to a man's soul. Hayes was from Georgia. He'd grown up under Jim Crow, had drunk from colored water fountains, had sat in the back of buses, had stepped off sidewalks to let white people pass. He joined the army in 1942 because he believed in fighting fascism, believed America's war was righteous despite America's sins. But the army had put him in a segregated unit, had given them cast-off equipment and inadequate training, had assigned them white officers who sometimes barely hid their contempt. Even here in Italy, even in a combat zone where death made no distinctions, the army maintained its racial boundaries with bureaucratic precision. But the Italians didn't care. They saw American soldiers, liberators, and that was enough. More than enough. Hayes remembered the night in Forte de Mar when an Italian woman had insisted he come inside, out of the rain, and sit at her family's table. Her husband had been killed by German soldiers 6 months earlier. Her home had been ransacked. She had almost nothing, but she sat Hayes down, gave him hot soup, and while he ate, she talked to him in broken English about her dead husband, about her hopes for her children, about her dreams for a world without war. She talked to him like he was a person, just a person, not a colored soldier or a second-class citizen or any of the categories that had defined his entire American life. Just a man who had suffered and fought and deserved kindness. Hayes had cried that night after he left her house. He'd found a quiet corner of the bombed-out village and cried like a child, and he wasn't even sure why. Maybe because of the kindness. Maybe because it made him realize how starved he'd been for simple human dignity. Maybe because he knew that when this war ended, when he went home to Georgia, the colored signs would still be there waiting for him. "You okay, Corporal?" Private First Class Robert Turner asked him one evening in late November. They were dug in near Petrosanta, waiting for orders to push toward the coast. German artillery rumbled in the distance like thunder that never stopped. "Just thinking," Hayes replied. "About home? About the difference between here and there?" Turner was quiet for a moment, cleaning his rifle with the automatic motions of a soldier who'd done it 10,000 times. He was from Harlem, had been a jazz musician before the war. "Yeah," he said finally. "I've been thinking about that too. These Italian folks, they treat us like we're heroes. Like we matter. But back home, ... single quotes," he trailed off, shaking his head. "Back home, we'll ride in the back of the bus," Hayes finished quietly. "If we're lucky," Turner said bitterly. "If we don't get lynched for wearing the uniform. You hear what happened to Sergeant Brooks's cousin? Came home to Mississippi in his dress uniform. Local whites didn't like it, didn't like a nigger acting proud. Beat him so bad he lost an eye." Hayes had heard stories like that filtered through the ranks, whispered in the dark, each one a reminder of what waited for them. They were fighting to free Europe from fascism, but they couldn't eat in the same restaurants as their white fellow soldiers. They were dying for democracy abroad while being denied it at home. The contradiction was so sharp, so painful, that sometimes Hayes felt like it might cut him in half. "You ever think about staying?" Turner asked suddenly. "After the war, I mean, just ... not going back?" The thought had crossed Hayes's mind more than once. Settle somewhere in Italy, maybe, or France? Find a place where a black man could walk down the street without calculating threat levels, without performing the elaborate dance of deference that survival required in the South. Start a new life in a country that might actually let him be human. But then he thought about his mother in Macon, about his little sister who wrote him letters full of hope and pride. He thought about his community, about the church where he'd been baptized, about all the people still fighting for change back home. If all the brave ones left, who would stay to make things better? "Nah," he said finally. "It's gotta go home. Gotta make it better. You're a better man than me, Corporal," Turner said softly. "Just a tired one." They sat in silence, listening to the distant guns, each lost in thoughts of homes that felt further away than the miles could measure. Lieutenant Marcus Johnson of the 366th Infantry Regiment's company stood at the entrance to what had once been a German headquarters in Viareggio and tried to make sense of the papers scattered across the floor. His Italian was rudimentary at best, but he could make out enough. Orders for executions, lists of hostages, reports on partisan activities. The brutality documented in neat German handwriting made his stomach turn. Behind him, his men were helping Italian civilians search through the rubble for salvageable belongings. Johnson watched Private Miller, a kid from Detroit who couldn't be more than 20, help an elderly Italian man lift a fallen beam. The old man kept blessing Miller, touching his arm, his shoulder, speaking rapid Italian that Miller couldn't understand but responding to with gentle nods and smiles. It was a scene repeated constantly, this strange and beautiful connection between black American soldiers and Italian civilians, bound together by shared humanity despite every difference of language and culture. "Sir," Sergeant First Class William Mason approached, his expression troubled. Mason was career Army, had been with the Buffalo Soldiers since before the war, and Johnson trusted his judgment absolutely. "We've got a problem." "What kind?" "The white kind." Johnson's jaw tightened. He knew immediately what Mason meant. There was a white reconnaissance unit bivouacked a mile outside town, and there had been tension from the start. Some of the white soldiers resented how warmly the Italians welcomed the black troops. They made comments, started fights, used every slur they knew. The Army officially prohibited fraternization between American soldiers and Italian women, but that rule seemed to be enforced much more strictly when it was black soldiers involved. "What happened?" "A couple of our guys were having coffee with some Italian families. Just being friendly. White MPs showed up, started making noise about fraternization regs, about how we were making America look bad." Mason's voice dripped with bitter irony on those last words. "Things got heated. Nobody threw punches yet, but it's close." Johnson closed his eyes briefly. This was the impossible position they lived in constantly, heroes to the Italians, suspect to their own army, fighting and dying for freedom while being denied basic dignity, expected to maintain discipline and morale while being subjected to systematic degradation. Where are they now? "I got our guys back to quarters." "But, sir, ... single quotes," Mason hesitated. "The Italians are pissed. They don't understand why the MPs were hassling us. Some of them were arguing with the white soldiers, defending our boys. It's a mess. Of course the Italians were defending them. That was the beautiful, terrible irony of it all. Italian civilians who'd just been liberated from fascism could see the injustice immediately. They couldn't understand why an army that preached freedom practiced segregation. They asked uncomfortable questions in their broken English. Why you not eat together? Why separate? You all American? No? You all fight same war? How do you explain Jim Crow to people who've never lived it? How do you make sense of a country that sends its black citizens to die for principles that doesn't apply to them at home? Johnson walked to the window and looked out at the damaged town. Smoke still rose from a few buildings. The afternoon sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across rubble-strewn streets. He could see Italian children playing in the ruins because children always found ways to play, even in war zones, and some of his soldiers watching over them, making sure they didn't stray near unexploded ordnance. "Tell the men to stay clear of the white units as much as possible," he said finally. "We've got enough enemies in German uniforms. We don't need to make more wearing American ones." "Yes, sir," Mason paused. "Sir, permission to speak freely?" "Always, Sergeant. This is wrong. All of it. We're good enough to die for this country, but not good enough to be treated like men. These Italian folks see us clearer in a week than most white Americans see us in a lifetime. When this war's over, when we go home, what are we going home to?" Johnson had no answer. He'd been asking himself the same question every day since they'd landed in Italy. He'd graduated from Howard University, had earned his commission the hard way, had proven himself in combat again and again. But he knew that when he went back to Virginia, his uniform wouldn't protect him from segregation. He'd still be directed to the colored entrance. He'd still be expected to step aside, look down, accept indignity as the price of survival. "We're going home to fight," he said finally. "A different kind of fight. We're going home to make people see what these Italians see, that we're men, that we deserve equality, that we've earned it in blood. This war will end, Sergeant, and when it does, we'll have the moral authority of having fought for freedom abroad. We'll use that. We have to." Mason nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." "I hope you're right. So do I, Sergeant." "So do I." The battle for the coastal town of Forte de Mar came in January 1945, during what the soldiers would remember as the coldest winter of their lives. Private Eugene Williams crouched in a shell crater as German machine gun fire ripped through the air above him, turning the morning mist into a curtain of death. His ears rang from artillery. His hands were so cold he could barely feel his rifle. Somewhere to his left he could hear screaming, American or German, he couldn't tell. All screaming sounded the same. "Williams. On me," Sergeant Carter's voice cut through the chaos. Williams forced himself up, forced his legs to move, ran in a crouch to where Carter had taken position behind a shattered wall. 3 other men from the squad were already there, Jackson. Washington and Martinez from the Puerto Rican unit that had been attached to them for this push. "We've got to flank that MG-42, Carter said, pointing toward a building about 50 yards away where muzzle flashes betrayed the German position. "Jackson, Washington, you lay down covering fire. Williams, Martinez, you're with me. We go right, use the rubble for cover, get close enough for grenades." "Clear." They were all terrified. Williams could see it in their eyes, in the way Washington's hands shook, in how Jackson kept whispering what might have been prayers or might have been curses. But they would do it anyway because that's what soldiers did. They overcame their fear and did what needed doing. "On my mark," Carter said. 3, 2, 1, go. Jackson and Washington opened up with their M1 South, and Williams ran. He ran through smoke and terror, Martinez beside him, both of them zigzagging through the rubble while the German machine gun tried to track them. The world narrowed to the next piece of cover, the next breath, the desperate hope that the bullets would miss. He felt something tug at his jacket, a round passing so close it caught the fabric, but then he was diving behind a pile of stones. Martinez crashing down beside him, both of them gasping. "Crazy," Martinez panted. "Absolutely crazy." Carter appeared a moment later, moving like a ghost through the smoke. He pulled a grenade from his belt, gestured for them to do the same. They crept forward until they were close enough to hear German voices from inside the building, young voices. Williams realized, probably teenagers, just scared kids like everyone else in this goddamned war. But scared kids could still kill you. Carter threw first, his grenade arcing perfectly through a blown-out window. Williams and Martinez threw a heartbeat later. They pressed themselves flat as the explosion shook the building as dust and debris rained down. Then silenced, a blottering silence, and Carter was up and moving. Rifle ready, Williams following, because that's what you did. You followed your sergeant even when every instinct screamed to stay down, stay safe. The German machine gun position was devastated. Williams looked away from the bodies, focused on his breathing, on not thinking about the fact that he'd just helped kill other human beings. Even if they were enemies, even if they'd been trying to kill him. You didn't think about it in the moment. You couldn't. or you'd freeze, and freezing meant dying. The thinking came later in the dark hours before dawn, when the adrenaline faded and left only horror and guilt and exhaustion. "Position secure," Carter called out. Williams set up watch. "The rest of you," he was interrupted by a new sound. Bells. Church bells, ringing wildly from somewhere deeper in the town. And then voices, Italian voices, shouting and singing. "What the hell?" Martina said. They moved cautiously toward the sound, clearing buildings as they went, always watching for Germans who might have stayed behind. But the enemy was gone, retreated inland, and what they found instead was a town emerging from hiding like flowers after winter. The people of Forte de Mar had been imprisoned in their own homes for months, locked down by the Germans, forbidden to leave, treated as slaves and hostages. But when they heard the American attack, when they saw the Germans falling back, they'd known liberation was at hand. Now they poured into the streets despite the danger, despite the fact that German artillery could still reach the town. They came out weeping and laughing and ringing the church bells in celebration. And when they saw Williams and the other soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division, when they saw their dark faces, there was no moment of hesitation, no pause for propaganda to work its poison. There was only joy, pure, unrestrained, uncomplicated joy. An Italian woman, maybe 30, thin from hunger, her clothes ragged, ran straight to Williams and threw her arms around him. She was sobbing into his chest, saying things he couldn't understand. And Williams stood there awkwardly, his rifle hanging loose, his hands gradually coming up to pat her back while she cried. Over her shoulder he saw Carter watching him, and the sergeant's eyes were wet. "You did good, Williams," Carter said quietly. "You did real good." Williams nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. In that moment, holding a weeping Italian woman who was thanking him for liberation, still half deaf from explosions, his hands shaking from adrenaline, his friend's blood drying on his uniform, in that moment Williams understood something fundamental about why they fought. Not for the politicians who still denied them equal rights. Not for the generals who commanded segregated armies. Not even for America exactly, though he loved his country despite its failures. They fought for this, for the right of people to live free from tyranny, for the chance to be seen as heroes instead of threats, for the possibility of a world where a black man from Mississippi could hold a weeping Italian woman and be recognized as her savior rather than her enemy. They fought because someone had to, and because in fighting they discovered their own humanity reflected in the eyes of strangers who became, if only for a moment, family. The medics of the 317th Engineer Regiment had a special status in the minds of Italian civilians. Corporal James Patterson had noticed it first in Petrosana, when a group of Italian women brought a sick child to him, begging for help despite having no way to pay. He'd treated the boy, a simple infection. Penicillin did the trick, and the next day, word had spread. Soon he was running an impromptu clinic from the back of his medical truck, treating Italian civilians whenever his duties allowed. The army officially frowned on this. Supplies were meant for American soldiers, not locals. But Patterson's captain looked the other way, and Patterson kept helping, because he'd become a medic to heal people, and these people desperately needed healing. "Tell me where it hurts," he said gently to an old man who'd been brought in by his daughter. Patterson's Italian was better now, learned phrase by phrase from grateful patients. The old man pointed to his chest, his breathing labored. Pneumonia, probably, made worse by months of malnutrition and stress. Patterson listened to his lungs, made his assessment, distributed medicine from his carefully hoarded supplies. The daughter wept with gratitude, pressing a small carved wooden cross into his hands, payment she couldn't afford but insisted on giving. Patterson accepted it because refusing would have hurt her pride, and he understood that pride was sometimes all people had left. "Grazie," she whispered. "Grazie, Dottore." He wasn't a doctor, just a corporal with medical training, but he didn't correct her. Let her have that bit of dignity, that belief that her father had been treated by someone important. After she left, Patterson sat outside his truck and looked at the cross. It was crude but beautiful, carved with obvious love and care. He added it to his collection, the growing assembly of small gifts that Italian civilians pressed on him and his fellow medics. Flowers, small religious medals, carefully preserved photographs, bits of food that the givers could barely spare. Each one a thank you, a blessing, a token of gratitude from people who had nothing but gave anyway. "You're going to need a bigger bag for all that stuff," said Corporal Anderson, another medic, as he joined Patterson. Anderson was from Chicago, had been studying to be a doctor before the war. "Italian grandmas keep trying to feed me. I've gained 5 pounds since we got to Tuscany. They see us as healers," Patterson said quietly. "It's safe. Maybe it's easier to accept help from us because we're different, unthreatening. Or maybe they just need help so badly they'll take it from anyone. Or maybe," Anderson said thoughtfully, They judge people by their actions instead of their skin color. Revolutionary concept. Patterson smiled wryly. Radical. They sat in companionable silence, watching the Italian town come alive around them. Children played in the streets, chasing a makeshift ball. Women hung laundry, actual clean laundry, now that they had water again and weren't afraid of attracting German attention. Old men sat in doorways, smoking precious cigarettes and watching the world slowly return to something resembling normal. American military trucks rumbled past, carrying supplies to the front. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled, a reminder that the war wasn't over, that the Gothic line still held, that men were still dying in those mountains. But here, in this small moment, there was something approaching peace. You ever wonder what it would have been like? Anderson asked suddenly. If we'd been treated like this back home. If we'd been welcomed as heroes instead of being sent to the back of every line. Every day, Patterson admitted. Every single day. My father was in the last war, Anderson said quietly. Fought in France, came home to Chicago expecting things to be better. They weren't. He told me once that the worst moment of his life wasn't anything that happened in combat. It was coming home in his uniform and being called boy by a white store clerk who'd never left Illinois. He said it broke something inside him, realizing he'd fought for a country that would never respect him. Patterson understood. They all understood, every black soldier serving in these segregated units. They all lived with that crushing disappointment, that daily reminder that their country saw them as less than full citizens, less than full human beings. But here, in Italy, for this brief moment of history, they were heroes. They were liberators. They were seen as men of honor and courage and worth. It wouldn't last. They knew it wouldn't last. Eventually the war would end and they'd go home to a country that would expect them to go back to the old patterns, the old degradations, as if nothing had changed. But something had changed. They had changed. They'd proven themselves in the crucible of combat. They'd been welcomed by grateful Europeans as equals and heroes. They'd tasted dignity and respect, and once you'd tasted it, you couldn't forget. When we get home, Patterson said slowly, we need to tell people. Tell them what we saw here. Tell them that the only place we were treated like men was in a foreign country by people we'd just met. Make them understand how wrong that is. Think anyone will listen? They'll have to, Patterson said with more conviction than he felt. We'll make them listen. Christmas 1944 came to the Serchio Valley in a blur of snow and suffering. First Lieutenant Thomas Brooks stood in the command post, a farmhouse that had survived the war, mostly intact, and studied the maps while his men prepared for what intelligence said would be a major German counterattack. The Gothic line offensive had stalled. The winter had turned brutal. American forces, including the 92nd Infantry Division, were dug in across the valleys and mountains of northwestern Italy, holding positions against an enemy that refused to break. Outside, Brooks could hear his men singing. It was Christmas Eve, and despite everything, despite the cold, despite their exhaustion, despite knowing that death waited in those mountains, they were singing. Spirituals, mostly. The old songs that their grandparents had sung in slavery and their parents had sung in freedom. Songs of suffering and hope intertwined, of endurance and faith, of promised lands and rivers to cross. Beautiful, isn't it? Major Reynolds, the battalion executive officer, stood beside Brooks. Reynolds was one of the few white officers in the division who genuinely respected his black troops, who saw them as soldiers rather than experiments or problems. These men have every reason to be bitter, every reason to hate. But listen to them. Still finding hope. Still finding faith. It's how we survived, Brooks said quietly. Hope and faith and stubborn refusal to give up. My grandmother was born a slave. She lived to see me become an officer in the United States Army. She told me once that survival was a form of resistance, that every day we lived and loved and built something good was a victory against those who wanted us to disappear. These men know that. They're singing because singing is survival. They're also singing because Italian families invited them to share Christmas dinner, Reynolds said with a slight smile. Word is half the town has adopted American soldiers for the holiday. Italian mamas don't take no for an answer. Brooks had to smile at that. It was true. The civilian population of the Serchio Valley had embraced the American soldiers with almost desperate affection. Families who had nothing shared what little they had. Every soldier seemed to have acquired an Italian grandmother who worried about whether they were eating enough, sleeping enough, staying warm enough. The cultural adoption went both ways, too. Brooks had watched his men teach Italian children to play baseball, had seen Italian women teaching soldiers to cook pasta properly, had observed 100 small moments of connection that transcended all barriers of language and culture. Sir, A sergeant appeared at the door, breathing hard. German movement in the North Valley. Looks like they're preparing for the attack. The moment shattered. Christmas would have to wait. Brooks grabbed his helmet, checked his sidearm, moved into the command mode that had kept him alive and kept his men alive through months of brutal combat. Outside, the singing had stopped. His soldiers were already moving to their positions, checking weapons, preparing for what came next. The German counterattack hit just after midnight, turning Christmas into a nightmare of artillery and automatic weapons fire. The battle raged for 3 days, some of the most intense fighting the division had seen. The 92nd held, they always held, despite inadequate supplies, despite the terrible weather, despite the doubts of higher commanders who questioned whether black soldiers could stand up to combat pressure. They held because they had something to prove, because they fought for each other, because giving ground meant letting down the Italian civilians who depended on their protection. When it was finally over, when the Germans had been thrown back with heavy losses, Brooks walked through the positions checking on his men. The cost had been high, too high. Every loss felt personal, felt like failure, even though he knew intellectually that this was war and losses were inevitable. But how do you accept the inevitable when it has names and faces, when it's men you ate with and joked with and promised to keep safe? He found Private Williams sitting in a foxhole staring at nothing. There was blood on his uniform, not his own, Brooks realized, but someone else's. Someone who hadn't made it. "Williams," Brooks said gently. "You okay?" Williams looked up slowly, his eyes ancient. "Lost Jackson, sir. Was right next to me and then he wasn't. Just ... gone." Brooks knelt beside him, ignoring the cold mud. "I'm sorry, son. Jackson was a good soldier. A good man. He was going to be a teacher, you know. After the war, going to teach history to the kids in Atlanta. He used to talk about it, about making sure black kids knew their own history, knew all the things we did that didn't make it into the white folks' textbooks." Williams's voice cracked. "Now he won't get to. All those kids he would have taught, they'll never know him. It's not fair, sir." "Nothing about this is fair." "No," Brooks agreed quietly. "It's not fair. Nothing about this war is fair. Nothing about our lives is fair. But we keep fighting anyway because the alternative is letting the darkness win." Jackson understood that. He fought and died for something bigger than himself, even though the country he fought for hasn't given him what he deserved. That takes a special kind of courage. "The Italians understood, sir," Williams said suddenly. "When we liberated that village last month, Gallicano, I think there was this old man who kept blessing us, kept saying we were sent by God. He looked at me like I was a hero, like I mattered. Back home, white folks cross the street when they see me coming. But here, this Italian man whose name I don't even know saw me as a savior." His voice broke. "Why can't America see us like that? Why do we have to come to a foreign country to be treated like human beings?" Brooks had no answer. He'd asked himself the same question 1,000 times. They sat together in that muddy foxhole while the sun rose over the mountains, turning the snow-covered peaks pink and gold. Beautiful and terrible and indifferent to the human suffering below. "When this war ends," Brooks said finally, "when we go home, we're going to tell people what happened here. We're going to make them understand that we proved ourselves, that we fought and bled and died for freedom, and we're going to demand that freedom for ourselves. The Italians see our worth. The Germans fear our courage. Only America refuses to recognize what's right in front of its eyes. But we're going to change that, Williams." "We have to." "Yes, sir," Williams whispered. "For Jackson. For all of them. For all of us." The war in Italy ended in May 1945. But for the soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division, the end was complicated. They'd fought from Rome to the Alps, had suffered terrible casualties, had proven their courage and capability in the face of both enemy fire and institutional racism. The Italian people had embraced them as heroes, had shown them a glimpse of what life could be like without segregation's daily cruelties. Now they faced going home to an America that hadn't changed, that would expect them to return to the old patterns of deference and degradation. Sergeant James Carter stood in the piazza of Lucca one last time, the same piazza where he'd been kissed and blessed by that Italian grandmother so many months ago. The town had rebuilt with remarkable speed. Windows were repaired, walls patched, streets cleared. Life had reasserted itself with stubborn insistence, the way it always did after war passed through. The same grandmother found him there. She was stronger now, no longer starved and desperate, and she carried a package wrapped in newspaper. She pressed it into his hand, speaking rapidly in Italian while tears ran down her weathered face. A young woman who'd learned some English translated. She says you must take this to remember that there are people who know what you did who will never forget. She says you are a hero, and when people tell you differently, you remember this place. You remember us. Carter opened the package carefully. Inside was a small painting, amateur but heartfelt, showing an American soldier standing in the piazza with Italian children gathered around him. The soldier's face was dark, rendered with obvious care. At the bottom, in careful letters, Il Liberatore, non dimenticare, the Liberator. Don't forget. Tell her, Carter said, his voice rough with emotion. Tell her that I won't forget. None of us will forget. What we found here, what you gave us, the respect, the dignity, the simple recognition of our humanity, we're taking that home with us. We're going to use it to change things. We have to. The old woman embraced him one last time, and Carter let himself cry. Let the tears fall for everything they'd endured and everything they'd lost and everything they'd found in this foreign land. Around the piazza, other soldiers were having similar goodbyes, accepting similar gifts, making similar promises. The bonds forged in liberation ran deeper than nationality or race. They were human bonds, the kind that war sometimes created even as it destroyed so much else. Private Eugene Williams stood at the train station with a group of Italian children who'd adopted him as a sort of older brother. They brought him drawings, hand-carved wooden toys, a carefully pressed flower, their treasures freely given. The smallest one, a little girl who'd learned a few English words, tugged his sleeve. "You come back?" she asked, her eyes enormous and hopeful. "After? You come back here?" Williams knelt down so he was eye level with her. "Maybe someday, Piccola, when the world is more peaceful, when I can come as a visitor instead of a soldier. You promise?" He shouldn't promise. Promises were dangerous things, too. Easily broken. But looking at her hopeful face, Williams found himself nodding. "I promise. I'll come back." She threw her arms around his neck and held on tight, and Williams hugged her back, wondering if he'd just lied to a child or made a vow he'd actually keep. He didn't know. The future felt hazy, uncertain, full of both danger and possibility. Corporal David Hayes watched his company board the trucks that would take them to the port, to the ships that would carry them home. Home. The word felt strange now, almost foreign. Home to Georgia, to Jim Crow, to segregation and second-class citizenship. Home to a country that would remember this war as a white man's victory, that would largely forget the contributions of black soldiers except as footnotes and afterthoughts. Home to the fight that still needed fighting. But Hayes wasn't the same man who'd left Georgia. None of them were the same. They'd been forged in combat, had proven themselves against every doubt and every slur and every low expectation. And they'd been loved, really loved, by people who'd seen past skin color to the men beneath. That changed you. That gave you strength for what came next. Lieutenant Marcus Johnson addressed his company one last time before they left Italian soil. He stood before men who'd followed him through hell, who'd trusted him with their lives, who'd become more than soldiers. They'd become brothers in the deepest sense. "Gentlemen," he said, and his voice carried clearly in the morning air, "we came to this country as soldiers in a segregated army, fighting for a nation that treats us as less than full citizens. We leave as veterans of a campaign that proved beyond any doubt that we are the equals of any soldiers in any army in the world. The Italians know this. They welcomed us, honored us, loved us as liberators. They saw us as heroes because we are heroes." He paused, looking at each face, seeing the pride and pain and determination reflected there. "When we get home, people will try to make us forget what we learned here. They'll try to push us back into the old patterns, the old degradations. They'll want us to be invisible again, to be quiet and grateful and accept less than we deserve. But we won't do that. We can't do that. We've seen what respect looks like. We've tasted dignity and freedom. We know our worth, even if America doesn't yet recognize it. The fight we're going home to won't be easy. It will take courage, maybe more courage than what we showed in combat, because this time we'll be fighting our own country, fighting to make it live up to its ideals, fighting for the rights we earned in blood. But if we can survive the Gothic line, if we can win the respect of people who were taught to fear us, we can do this too. We will do this. Years from now, when our children ask us about this war, we'll tell them about more than battles. We'll tell them about Italian grandmothers who blessed us, about children who held our hands without fear, about people who saw us as human beings when our own country would not. We'll tell them that dignity and respect aren't gifts to be granted, they're rights to be claimed. And we'll tell them that we claimed those rights here in Italy among strangers who became friends, and that we brought that knowledge home to change America." The men stood silent, absorbing his words, straightening their shoulders, lifting their heads. They'd been broken down by segregation, by racism, by a system designed to diminish them, but they'd been built back up by combat, by camaraderie, by the love of Italian people who'd seen their true worth. They were leaving Italy as different men, stronger, prouder, more certain of their value. As the trucks pulled away, Carter looked back at Lucca one last time. The ancient walls rose against the morning sky. The medieval towers stood proud. The church bells rang out across the valley. Italian civilians lined the streets, waving and crying, calling out goodbyes and blessings. Children ran alongside the trucks for as long as they could, their voices high and clear. Arrivederci, grazie, non dimenticare, don't forget. Carter wouldn't forget. None of them would forget. The memory of Italy, of being treated with dignity, of being seen as heroes, of being loved simply for being liberators, that memory would sustain them through the struggles ahead. It would be proof, undeniable proof, that their worth wasn't a matter of opinion or prejudice, but of simple human fact. They were men. They were soldiers. They were heroes. Italy had recognized it, even if America still refused to. The trucks rolled south toward the port, toward the ships, toward home and everything that word implied, both the warmth of family and the pain of injustice, both the joy of return and the burden of struggle. But they carried with them something precious, something that couldn't be taken away, the knowledge that they'd mattered, that their lives had meaning, that they'd changed history and been changed by it. In the years that followed, those soldiers would return to an America still deeply segregated, still hostile to black advancement. They would face discrimination in housing, employment, education. They would be denied benefits given freely to white veterans. They would watch as the contributions of black soldiers were minimized or erased from popular histories of the war. The promises of equality and opportunity would prove as hollow as they'd feared. But they would also become the backbone of the civil rights movement. The same courage that carried them through combat would fuel their fight for equality at home. The same determination that held the Gothic line would sustain them through boycotts and marches and struggles for voting rights. The dignity they had experienced in Italy, the simple recognition of their humanity, became the standard they demanded for themselves and their children. And in their quiet moments, in the dark hours when doubt crept in and the struggle seemed endless, they would remember. They would remember the Italian grandmother who kissed their hands. They would remember the children who ran to them without fear. They would remember being called liberators and heroes and saviors. They would remember that somewhere in the world, even if only for a brief time, they had been seen truly and loved completely and honored as they deserved. That memory was worth more than medals. It was worth more than official recognition. It was the proof that dignity and respect and equality weren't impossible dreams but achievable realities. Italy had shown them what the world could be. Now they would fight to make America become what it claimed to be. The trucks disappeared into the distance, carrying those soldiers toward their ships, toward their future, toward their destiny as warriors for justice in a different kind of war. Behind them, the people of Tuscany stood in their rebuilt towns and villages, waving until the Americans were out of sight, keeping faith with the promise of remembrance. Don't forget, they had said. They never did.